The, quote, welfare state illusion, end quote, and the contradiction between wage labor and capital, by Wolfgang Müller and Christel Neusüss. This is from State and Capital, a Marxist Debate, edited by John Holloway and Sol Picciotto, or Picciotto, not quite sure. The political importance of revisionist theories of the state. In the history of the workers' movement, the theoretical evaluation of the relationship between the state and capitalist society has been one of the most important elements of the debates on the correct political strategy and form of organization of the working class. Revolutionary and revisionist positions can be distinguished in these debates by their views of the role of the state in capitalist society. The conception of the state as a more or less independent institution standing outside the contradictions of society has been and still is the assumption behind all revisionist strategy and practice. Revisionist strategy starts with the intention of replacing capitalism with socialism, but it takes the path of legal reforms within existing society. By means of the gradual acquisition of state power by the working class. Revisionist theoreticians gradually give up the concepts of the workers' movement, thus, e.g., instead of referring to the, quote, working class, end quote, they speak of, quote, democratic forces, end quote. But this option for a continuous, quote, revolution from above, end quote, has so far in the history of the workers' movement always ended in quite explicit abandonment of socialism as a political goal. Quote, that is why people who pronounce themselves in favor of the method of legislative reform in place of and in contradistinction to the conquest of political power and social revolution do not really choose a more tranquil, calmer, and slower road to the same goal, but a different goal. Instead of taking a stand for the establishment of a new society, they take a stand for a surface modification of the old society. Uh-oh. Missed a quotation mark. Quote, that is why people who pronounce themselves in favor of the method of legislative reform in place of and in contradistinction to the conquest of political power and social revolution do not really choose a more tranquil, calmer, and slower road to the same goal, but a different goal. Instead of taking a stand for the establishment of a new society, they take a stand for surface modifications of the old society. End quote. Rosa Luxemburg, of course. A strategy which raises the bourgeois state to the position of an instrument of social change can only be thought to have a possibility of success if the state is seen as a, quote, sacred vessel, end quote, which can be filled with capitalist or socialist contents according to the historical situation, and if it were the state which produced the forms within which social life is reproduced. On this, Marx says that, quote, the concentration of bourgeois society is in the form of the state, end quote, means that we must treat, quote, existing society as the basis of the existing state, end quote. That is to say that the bourgeois state is the product of a society of developed commodity production, i.e. a capitalist society, and of the contradictions which arise from this form of production. Hence, it is an institution molded by these contradictions. The revision of this concept of the state in revisionist theories consequently involved their rejection of the conception that the abolition of the capitalist mode of production can be achieved not through the state apparatus, but only by the revolutionary working class. Once the bourgeois state is seen to be the product of developed commodity production, i.e. capitalist society, and the strategy of the workers' movement is defined accordingly, it becomes necessary to take the critique of revisionism beyond the narrow criticism of its conception of political institutions. Yet so far this has been the usual level of politically relevant debate with revisionist state theories on the part of the left in West Germany and West Berlin, the critique of parliamentarism, the discussion on participation in the elections to the Federal Assembly, when the SDS, Socialist Students Association, had to work out a line on the political function of a socialist party in a bourgeois parliament under conditions of monopoly capitalism, were the occasion for a revival of the critique of bourgeois parliamentarism by Marx, Engels, Pennecook, and others, together with Agnoli's Transformation der Demokratie of 1967, their works helped to develop a basis for the view that Parliament was not a platform for the class struggle, and certainly not an instrument for the introduction of socialism, as the DKP, German Communist Party, still believes. The current uncertainty on the left as to the degree of freedom of action of the SPD government and its scope for, quote, crisis management, end quote, demonstrates that the critique of Parliament, i.e. the political critique of a political institution, can only be one aspect of the critical discussion of revisionism. This criticism, if it is taken seriously, must become a critique of the development of the various functions of the modern state, as its, quote, instruments, end quote, for regulating the, quote, economy, end quote, and ensuring social, quote, consensus, end quote, and of its concrete limits and contradictions. For the definition and criticism of state institutions as the instruments of manipulation of the ruling class does not enable us to discover the limits of that manipulation. These can only be revealed by an analysis which shows in detail the needs for and the limits to state intervention, arising from the contradictions of the capitalist process of production as a labor process and a valorization process. In this light, Lenin's theory of imperialism, for example, is more relevant than his explanation of the Marxist theory of the state in State and Revolution for the evaluation of the bourgeois state and its functions in the capital valorization process. This is because in State and Revolution, Lenin tends to discuss the state in general independently of the particular form which the state adopts in the various historical phases of the organization of the material reproduction of society. So the distinction between the feudal and the bourgeois state fade away in the immediate polemic with the Mensheviks and the revisionist German Social Democrats just before the October Revolution. This is the direct result of Lenin's purpose in State and Revolution of carrying out a political critique of political institutions to demonstrate that the state apparatus must collapse and be smashed by the revolutionary working class. In State and Revolution, the question is, what should be the political strategy of the working class in a revolutionary situation towards the political institutions of the state apparatus? But if the problem is to determine the freedom of action and the strategic perspectives of a socialist movement, which is only at a formative stage, a Marxist theory of the state, such as Lenin's State and Revolution, does not offer much help, since it refers generally to the need to smash the state apparatus, but provides no tools to evaluate the effectiveness and extent of state interventions in the process of capital valorization. Hence, it is not suitable for the use often made of it as an introduction to the, quote, end quote, Marxist theory of the state. In order to develop strategies, what we need today above all is to develop criteria as to how far the manipulative possibilities of the state apparatus extend, where they stop, where they produce new contradictions, where they contain in capitalist form elements of a true socialization of production, e.g. in the standardization of the elements of production, etc. We are concerned, therefore, not with the formulation of a general Marxist theory of the state, but with the investigation of the specific functions of the state in safeguarding the process of capital valorization under advanced capitalism and of the limits of these state functions. Revisionism is the form in which the class enemy entrenches itself within the workers' movement itself, in which the ideology of the ruling class is propagated as the ruling ideology of the working class. This propagation is naturally not, quote, by means of a mere idea, end quote, but results from actual experiences which are the common background to both revisionist theories and also the false consciousness of the workers. The development of revisionism in the workers' movement depends crucially on the experience of, quote, social welfare legislation enacted by the bourgeois state, which limits the particular forms of exploitation of the worker in the capitalist enterprise by establishing a minimum subsistence level through workmen's protection legislation. In social security systems, the material existence of wage laborers is ensured during the times when they cannot sell their labor power as a commodity on the market: sickness, old age, unemployment. Such legislation could easily seem to be a limitation on the domination of capital over living labor, especially as its enactment has always been the mediated result of class struggles. In the eyes of the working class, or especially of its organization, the state could thus appear to be an instrument which could be used by, quote, salami tactics, end quote, to achieve political and social power bit by bit, one slice at a time. As Zering correctly puts it, quote, there is a tendency for the level of development of this state function, transport, education, welfare, to parallel the strength of reformism up to a certain point, end quote. Increasing intervention by the state for economic and social policy, the concentration of capital and lengthening periods of prosperity, especially before the First World War and after the Second, provide the main basis for the experience which makes it seem possible for capital to be gradually transformed by means of state apparatus. This possibility reappears in new guises before the First World War in Bernstein's theory, during the Weimar Republic in the theory of organized capitalism and economic democracy. Hilferding, Naftali, etc. And at the start of the Federal Republic in 1949, in the 1949 Munich program of the DGB, Deutsche Gewerkschaftsbund, Trade Union Federation, again in the theories that characterize the present phase of capitalist development as state monopoly capitalism, e.g., quote, Imperialismus heute. End quote. And finally, in the theory of the welfare interventionist state as developed by the Frankfurt School, Habermas, Ofa, et al. The relationship between the empirical consciousness of workers and also of students. Yeah? Okay. The relationship between the empirical consciousness of workers and also of students and revisionist theory consists in the effect that theory has of establishing a foundation for experience and reinforcing it, hence giving it the appearance of inevitability. This has two implications. First, political agitation among the working class must take into account a long tradition of reformism. The critique of reformist ideas is, if anything, more important for student agitation in the university, since they are more closely tied to the state than are wage workers. This debate with reformism can only take place by demonstrating in detail the connections between economic relations and political forms, between economic and political struggle. Secondly, this leads to the conclusion that revisionism and false consciousness cannot ultimately be destroyed through theory alone, but that social and class struggles are a necessary part of this process. Capital is the precondition for the particularization of the state. The form of social production based on the relationship of capital and wage labor has the particular special quality that under it People cannot envisage at the outset the way in which they can sustain themselves. Instead, the contradictory internal tendencies of the capital relation, which are mediated, of course, through the activity of the agents of capital, lead to consequences which the individual servants of capital themselves do not consciously desire, and against which they, as individual capitalists, are powerless. It is indeed true that the state exists for the sake of private property and capital, and that it is, quote, nothing more than the form of organization which the bourgeois are compelled to adopt both for internal and external purposes for the mutual guarantee of their property and interest, end quote. But this itself does not at all mean that the state can be simply identified with capital, with this particular form of social production. Rather, the state is characterized precisely by the fact that it is based on the emancipation of property as private property from the original unity of common property, and that on this basis it, quote, has become a particular entity alongside and outside civil society, end quote. German ideology. It is important to emphasize that it is on this basis that this particularization of the state as an entity, quote, alongside and outside, end quote, bourgeois society occurs, that is to say, on the internally contradictory basis of capitalist production. The actual particularization on the basis of this contradiction then leads to conceptions that are, quote, inverted, quote, mystical, idealist. These terms are continually used by Marx. According to these conceptions, the state is independent from and opposed to society. It is the true subject whose object is, quote, society, end quote, as a whole. Marx criticizes this view in his critique of Hegel's philosophy of law. This essentially already contains, although in abstract form, the critique of the revisionist theory of the state, which although it pays lip service to the primacy of society, to the antagonism of wage labor and capital, nevertheless, by asserting that the state can regulate the social contradiction, elevates the state to a subject. Readers of Capital, the book, can easily understand this development of the state as a, quote, particular entity alongside and outside civil society, end quote, by recalling the dialectical development of the value form and then the money form from the contradiction between value and use value contained in the commodity, embodied in the dual character of the product of labor as a commodity. This contradiction can only become apparent if it is expressed by a particular commodity, the money commodity. The value form of the commodity, which cannot be expressed in its own use-value form, becomes expressed by the use-value form of a particular commodity, which thus becomes money. Money now appears as an independent thing, and the socio-historic character of value becomes attached to money, either as a natural characteristic of money or by virtue of a supposed common agreement between people. The same, quote, fetishism, end quote, can be seen in the form of the state. According to the bourgeois conception, either the state has always existed since man, quote, is by nature a creature of the state, end quote, or else the state is indispensable for social, i.e. bourgeois life, or again, it was established consciously by social contract. The fact that it is the particularization of a specific mode of production, capitalism, is turned on its head. This reification and autonomization of the state is a necessary illusion resulting from the bourgeois mode of production, just as much as are the forms of money, capital, wage labor, profit, factors of production, or revenues. These illusions are forced upon the agents of production by the particular mechanism of this form of production, and it is these which really determine their activity. It is for this reason that the state is not the, quote, real collective capitalist, end quote, but the, quote, ideal, end quote, quote, fictitious collective capitalist, end quote. Capital's interest in maintaining the basis of its existence can only develop subsequently, and in face of a threat to the very foundation of this mode of production. The most important relationship, the one that determines the real behavior of capital, is the relationship of the individual capital to its source of surplus value, the workers it exploits. Grundrisse, quote, what could possibly show better the character of the capitalist mode of production than the necessity that exists for forcing upon it by acts of parliament the simplest appliances for maintaining cleanliness and health." End quote. Capital, Volume 1. The process of thus gradually, quote, "forcing upon it," end quote, these requirements, mediated by catastrophes and conflicts, victories and defeats, establishes the, quote, "welfare state," end quote, the, quote, "interventionist state," end quote, etc., as a particular coercive power in which capital externally confronts itself. This process also first engenders the struggles of different, quote, "interest groups," end quote, which consolidate. One second. The process also engenders the struggle of different, quote, "interest groups," end quote, which consolidate positions in the institutions of the state itself and of the approaches to it. This constitutes the, quote, "formation of the political will," end quote, which is then turned into the object of political science, but is a phenomenon uprooted from its original source. Since any intervention in the imminent compulsion to capital valorization must be forced upon capital as an immanent law by an institution external to itself, this institution must be equipped with supervisory jurisdiction and effective sanctioning powers. In short, a giant and growing bureaucratic apparatus of coercion. The mere existence of this, quote, "state apparatus," end quote, again reinforces the illusion that the state is, quote, "autonomous," end quote, that the state is able to, quote, "intervene," end quote, in, quote, "the economy," end quote. But the fact that this apparatus exists does not mean that it really can effectively intervene, quite apart from the systematic establishment of counter-apparatuses for evading or resisting this coercive power, businessmen's associations and lobbies, taxation, quote, "advice," end quote, bureau, etc. The particular existence of the state is therefore not an obvious matter, not even in a class society. This particular existence of an exclusively political coercive institution, the state, becomes possible and necessary only with the privatization of the sphere of subsistence and maintenance of life, which in pre-capitalist societies was a priori a common social matter, and with the development of private as distinct from communal property. As early as his critique of Hegel's philosophy of law in 1843, Marx described the bourgeois, quote, "mysticism," end quote, which turned the, quote, "actual relation of family and civil society to the state," end quote, upside down, so that, quote, "the condition is postulated as the conditioned, the determinant as the determined, the producing factor as the product of its product," end quote. Quote, "It is obvious that the political constitution as such is brought into being only where the private spheres, property, contract, marriage, civil society, have won an independent existence. Where trade and landed property are not free and have not yet become independent, the political constitution too does not yet exist. In the Middle Ages there were serfs, feudal estates, merchants and trade guilds, corporations of scholars, etc. That is to say, in the Middle Ages, property, trade, society, man are political. The material content of the state is given by its form. Every private sphere has a political character, or is a political sphere. In the Middle Ages, the life of the nation and the life of the state are identical," end quote. These comments by Marx on the Middle Ages apply also to every pre-bourgeois social formation, as he subsequently indicates with reference to the city-states of antiquity, and later repeats in the preparatory writings for Capital. In the old, quote, "communal," end quote, system, that of the, quote, "clan," end quote, the, quote, "commonwealth," end quote, or the, quote, "commune," end quote, the state did not exist as a, quote, "particular reality alongside the real life of the people," end quote, but rather the, quote, "political," end quote, organization, e.g. members of a tribe, was the precondition and guarantee of the appropriation of the objective conditions of life through labor. For such pre-capitalist communities, catastrophes occur either as actual natural calamities or through clashes with other communities, but not as natural catastrophes of society, as is the case in the inverted world of capital. Hence it is to express a necessary consequence contained in Capital that Marx, in Capital, after developing the category of absolute surplus value, immediately turns to the description of the catastrophes which the production of surplus value entails for living labor. From this derives the particularization of the state in the factory legislation. So long as the purpose of labor is the production of use values, the subsistence of social individuals, there is no need for a particular regulatory and coercive organization which seeks to prevent individuals and society from destroying themselves through an excess of work. Only with capitalist commodity production is this connection broken and the problem of the self-destruction of society created. The concentration of bourgeois society in the form of the state, that is to say, its concentration in an institution which appears as external to itself, which appears to float above it as a, quote, particular existence, end quote, is necessary because only in this way can the existence of capitalist society be assured at all. Since the direct aim of production is not social subsistence, but surplus value production, and since the process of production is therefore driven on by laws which are concealed from the conscious will of individuals, and are implemented behind their backs, although by means of their own actions, there is a real need for such a particular social institution which confronts productive society. This ex post facto, and makeshift supervision by the state of the natural pattern of the social production process, is necessary for the maintenance of surplus value production, which is the particular form of appropriation of the surplus labor of one class by another class. Therefore, this supervision aims to maintain the class character of this society. It is one of the functions which the state must take over in this class society. The function of direct oppression would not be dealt with in this context, since this is the very aspect which is not the primary element typifying this particular form of society. The misunderstanding of this basic point often leads to a false perspective on the nature and organization of the revolutionary upheaval. Quote, social policy, end quote, i.e., state activity intervening ex post facto in society and seeking to resolve its, quote, social problems, end quote, thus has the characteristics, down to its smallest detail, of a process of paternalistic supervision, control or, quote, welfare, end quote, of the producer. This is felt by every worker who has to wait in the queue to see the medical official, the bureaucrat who certifies him as fit to work, who repairs his labor power as quickly as possible. Hence, however much state social policy offers individual producers a certain security in the event of their partial or total inability to work, social policy can never provide a conscious and planned care for the maintenance, renewal, and improvement of the social working capacity of the collective worker, the associated producers themselves. In a communist society, such a planned care would necessarily be part of the collective social production process. It would be a public responsibility of society and of its members, as would the rest of social subsistence, and not the object of the abstract bureaucratic activity of a particular political association.